Shadow Secretary of State Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The climate crisis is the most pressing issue facing our planet. What actions we take in the next few years will determine whether we can address the climate emergency or whether we pass on a rotten inheritance to our children to live on a dying planet. It's with great responsibility, therefore, that we come to debate this bill. The government is calling it a landmark bill, world-leading legislation. I'm fear that's not quite right. And I think the Minister should be more honest in that this still seems like a draft bill, a bill that's not quite there, an OK bill, but by no means the groundbreaking piece of legislation that we had been promised.
He's absolutely right in what he says, and I wonder if he shares my concern and disappointment that the Secretary of State didn't mention Part 8 of the bill, which refers to the potential for divergence from incredibly important regulations on the chemical industry, which affects our entire manufacturing sector, not just the chemical industry itself. Does he share my concern that Part 8 has the ability to diverge with very serious consequences for most of our economy?
Well, I'm grateful to my friend for his intervention. I think the details around regression and non-regression is an important part of this bill. We need to make sure that we're maintaining the high standards that we've got, because those high standards, especially in the chemical industries, drive jobs and employment right across the country. And any risk of divergence of that affects the ability of those products to be sold overseas, and that affects the ability of jobs to be held back in our country. So that is a good issue. I'm glad my honourable friend raised it. Some members in this House will remember when Parliament adopted Labour's motion to declare a climate emergency. And for me, that presents us with a very simple challenge, and that is it. Now that Parliament has declared a climate emergency, what are you doing differently? It is a challenge to us as individuals, to businesses, but especially to lawmakers, ministers and regulators. Because the climate crisis is real, we need bolder and swifter action to decarbonise our economy and protect vulnerable habitats. We need to recognise that it's not just a crisis about carbon, although it is. It's about other greenhouse gases too. And it's also an ecological emergency, with our planet's animals, birds and insect species in decline and habitats under threat. The water we drink, the food we consume, the fish in our seas are all affected by pollutants, from plastics to chemicals. And as we've seen from the floods caused by Storm Ciara and Dennis, the climate crisis is also leading to more extreme weather, happening more often and with more severe consequences. Happy to.
I thank my honourable friend giving way on that point. The National Flood Forum has noted that extreme and flash flooding will be one of the greatest effects of the climate crisis. In my constituency of Pontypridd, we have experienced unprecedented flooding, and the River Taff's levels rose by over a metre on all previous records. If that isn't a wake-up call, I really don't know what is.
That's right, Alex.
Would my honourable friend agree that the government needs to act urgently to secure better climate protections to ensure that other towns, villages and cities across the world are not impacted like my community has been this week?
Well, I'm grateful for my honourable friend for her intervention and for all the work that her and her Welsh colleagues have been doing in supporting those communities that are underwater. We need much firmer action. A proper plan for flooding that reverses the austerity cuts that have happened to our flood defences, that removes the requirement for matched funding that favours affluent communities over poorer communities, and we need urgent action from the government to address the really worrying aspects around the legacy of the coal industry in Wales that could see a real disaster if action is not taken. So I encourage her to carry on campaigning in that respect. Britain, as my friend has mentioned, is not unique in the challenges facing us in terms of the climate catastrophe. In many cases, what will happen in the global south will be even more disastrous than what is happening in the UK. That's why action cannot wait. So, yes.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member for giving way. He will be aware of concerns that the bill does not focus enough on the UK's global footprint. And so would he agree with me that the government should introduce a mandatory due diligence mechanism that would help to reduce the UK's global footprint?
Well, I'm grateful for the honourable member for that intervention. I think it's a good reminder that actually one of the ways that we have decarbonised in the past few years has simply been to export our carbon. To export it not in terms of the waste that we export, but also in terms of the production of the most carbon-intensive products that we use. So it's a good point that he raised. I'm going to make some progress before I take any further interventions, mindful of the people that are following us. As a nation, we need a gold standard environment bill. I agree with the Minister when he says that we need that world-leading legislation. But this is not that world-leading legislation. It still looks like a draft bill. It hasn't had complete pre-legislative scrutiny for the entire bill, which I think it needs. It lacks coherence between the different sections of the bill, and it lacks the ambition to tackle the climate crisis as a whole with a comprehensive and renewed strategy. Now, Labour will be a critical friend to ministers during this process. We will not be opposing the bill today, but in that spirit, we hope ministers will look seriously at adopting the measures we will put forward to improve this bill and strengthen it, especially at committee stage. There is a cause for concern that I have about the positioning of this bill, that it's been spun so hard by successive governments, Secretary of States in particular, that it can't possibly deliver the grand soundbites that it's been set up to do. That means that the heavy lifting that's required now to address our decarbonisation efforts and to protect our communities may be hampered because it won't be able to deliver on those lofty promises. I really worry that unless we match those grand soundbites with determined action, we'll be failing our children and failing the communities that we are here to serve. In the time left, I want to cover three key areas of concern about this bill. First, Labour's belief that non-regression of environmental standards must be a legal requirement. Secondly, how the new Office of Environmental Protection needs to be strengthened and how the ambition of government press releases needs to be translated into genuine delivery in this bill. Firstly, on standards and targets. We were promised during the election that the government would not lower our food standards, despite all the evidence pointing to the contrary in post-Brexit trade deals. As we've already seen with the debates around the agriculture bill, ministers have chosen to leave the door open when it comes to undercutting British farm and food standards in post-Brexit trade deals. The new Environment Secretary cannot even guarantee that chlorinated chicken or lactic acid washed chicken won't be allowed into Britain as a result of the US trade deal. The rough ride that he got with the National Farmers Union this morning will just be the start if he doesn't come to the realisation that many of us in this House have on both sides, that that commitment that he and others have given must be put in law. We can't allow our standards to be undercut. And that principle of not allowing our standards to be undercut applies to this bill too. We need to make sure that non-regression on environmental standards with the EU is a flaw that we must not go below. I'm going to make some bit of progress. I'll come back to you in a moment if I can. We simply cannot allow our environmental standards to be undercut, in the same way as our food and animal welfare standards risk being undercut with trade deals. Indeed, we need to make sure that we have measures approaching dynamic alignment with the European Union to make sure that Britain isn't seen as a country with lower standards in comparison to our European friends, because a lower regulatory standards and a lower animal welfare standards, especially on imported food, will see damage to ecosystems, habitats and a downward pressure on regulation in future times, which will damage our efforts to decarbonise our economy. I want to see the lofty words said by all the ministers on the front bench and the Prime Minister about non-regression put into this bill. So where is the legal commitment to non-regression on environmental protections that the British people have asked for? Why is it not clearly in this bill? If we have any hope of tackling the climate emergency in a meaningful way, we need to be aiming towards net zero by 2030, not by 2050.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. On the question of net zero by 2030, does he not recognise what the Committee on Climate Change recognises, indeed Baroness Brown in the other place, that net zero by 2050 in and of itself will be a huge challenge for this country? Blithely throwing out 2030 as if that is easy is doing a disservice not just to this House but to the people watching.
I'm a big fan of the honourable gentleman's Instagram feed, and I follow it with great passion. And sometimes I feel a bit disappointed by interventions like this. We can't afford not to hit net zero by 2030, but the government's currently on track for 2099. Right? A far-off date, many, many moons away, will not deal with the climate emergency that we have, will not protect our habitats that we need protecting. That drive needs to be there, but we know that for some sectors, achieving a net zero date by 2030 will be very challenging. For some, achieving it by 2050 will be very challenging, agriculture being one of those sectors. The NFU's plan to hit net zero by 2040 is very challenging, and if sectors are to deliver net zero by any date, we'll need some sectors to go faster and further than others to create carbon headroom on the requirement that that progress is not double counted in carbon calculations. This supposedly world-leading environment bill sadly does not have a single target in this bill, no duty on ministers to ensure that Britain decarbonises and stops the climate crisis getting any worse. Secondly, I want to turn to the Office of Environmental Protection, the proposed new regulator. I know from previous debates that there are members opposite who are not too keen on the idea of a new government outfit being created in this space. But I agree with ministers that we do need a robust regulator. Sadly, the one being proposed in this bill is not strong enough in our view. We need it to have teeth, a remit that is unaffected by government patronage, a careful consideration of the science and a bite that would make ministers think twice about missing their targets. That is what the Office of Environmental Protection should be, but that's sadly not what this bill envisages. The new regulator does not have true independence from government. It has no legal powers to hold the government to account in the way it needs to. Approving its chair by a government-led select committee, where the government has a majority, I don't think is sufficient. When ministers have been dragged time and time again through the courts for missing air quality targets, how can we ensure that this regulator would make that a thing of the past and not a repeat prescription? We need ministers to do as members on both sides have suggested today and adopt WHO targets for air quality and particulates. We need regulators to have teeth to make sure those targets are enforced, and we need to make sure that that new regulator sits and works in a complementary way with what is already a quite congested regulatory space around the environment already.
My honourable friend give way.
Happy to, briefly.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Prospects, the union, have written to me expressing their concern that only 100 staff will be employed by the Office for Environment Protection. Does the Shadow Minister share my concerns about this under-resourcing?
Yes. Yes.
I thank one more friend for that intervention. And what we've seen since 2010 is that Quango's regulators can still exist, but their ability to deliver that regulation, the quality of that regulation, depends on the resources. If there is a political lever being applied by ministers, and as I've said before, I have a lot of time for the current Environment Secretary, but that doesn't necessarily mean anyone that follows him would have the same approach. If budgets were to be changed and political patronage were to be applied in terms of the way it's dealt with in terms of its leadership and its board, then that could affect the outcomes. Resourcing does matter. I'll not take any further interventions so I can finish the remarks. Although that would have been a good time for one. Thank you very much. Right, the section on water I'd like to turn to next. Unless someone would like to intervene very briefly at this point here. I would love you to give way. Thank you very much.
Well, in the spirit of kindness, the serious point, next to my constituency is Luton Airport. One of the concerns that many of my constituents have is the air quality of my constituency in relation to Luton Airport. Indeed, all our constituencies will have separate issues. What's the honourable gentleman's view on how we can use this bill to apply to specific instances at specific times, such as poor air quality around Luton Airport?
Well, I'm very grateful for him, and I will like more of his Instagram posts as a reward for that very kind intervention. I think we do need to address air quality around airports and transport modes in particular. The ability to do that is predicated on the data, though, and that's why one more friend from Warrington Leamington, who made that point earlier, making sure we're doing it based on reliable evidence is important. That means we need to have the right testing stations. And at the moment, I still feel there's far too few air quality monitoring stations. And I think a way of embracing that, so it's on more schools, more GP surgeries, more areas of public, a greater level of public dwelling, is actually the way that we need to go forwards. And I think that is the way that we address it. But in particular for airports, it's about surface access, making sure that people can get to airports easier. Now, because I've been coughing and spluttering for a while, I'll rush through briefly so I can follow the ones that, so I don't take up anyone else's time. In relation to the section on water, as honourable members opposite have already addressed, this doesn't go further enough to deal with some of the issues around water poverty or do anything to address per capita consumption, meaningful water labelling, or solve the challenge of where we're going to get the water we need for the homes that we need to build in the future. I think if this is to be genuinely world-leading, I would have hoped the government would have adopted some of the really groundbreaking areas around water policy at the moment, such as water neutrality. The idea that for every new home that we build, we won't be providing any more water resources, that will be offset by water efficiency in our existing housing stock. There are some really grand opportunities and some fantastic water innovations, but that's why we need this bill to go further on water efficiency in our homes, actions on leaks and investment in our water efficient technologies, and a war on leaky loos as important as that is. I would also like to see the government look at a commitment where the water industry has moved to using 100% renewable energy within the next 5 years. That is a power that ministers already have with the regulatory powers that Ofwat and DEFRA already has. Finally, the last section I just want to turn to is about trees. The Minister has already mentioned that the new bill includes a section on trees that would allow trees to be chopped down in a different way. It doesn't include any new powers to plant trees. Now, that seems an omission, which I imagine on both sides of the House, people will be looking at the bill and saying, surely that's not right. When the government is missing its tree planting target by 71% already, further powers to chop down trees doesn't seem to be the priority in my mind. We need to look at how we're planting not only more trees, different types of biodiversity habitats, and making sure that carbon is sequestered in the right way. That is really important, because if we are to address the loss of species, both in the UK and globally, we need to take action. COP26 provides us with a global platform to showcase the very best of our global thinking, our action and our legislation. This bill, at the moment, doesn't deliver that groundbreaking global platform that I think we need to take into that. And I hope ministers will take seriously the concerns that myself and the honourable colleagues behind me who will speak later will address, because there is a real desire on both sides of the House to improve this legislation, to make it that genuine world-leading piece of legislation that the Minister aspires for it to be. But to do that, I invite the Minister to work with us to improve this legislation. Simply voting down every amendment so we can keep a clean sheet, I don't think will deliver that. And I hope that he will take that challenge in the spirit that it's meant, so we can work together to improve this piece of legislation, because the climate crisis needs to be addressed, and it won't be sufficiently addressed in the way it needs to if we allow this bill to go through unaltered. Thank you.